The New England region overall is the safest area in the United States. There's no debating that. 5 of the region's 6 states make America's top 10 safest list year after year, but that doesn't mean that the New England region doesn't have one of the oldest and most deeply entrenched street cultures on the East Coast. Street organizations, both nationally syndicated and locally homegrown, have called New England cities home for decades upon decades. Let's discuss the cities, hoods, and organizations of our fair region as we break down the 10 most gangster cities in New England. What's up, everybody? Welcome back. Well, I have a very exciting video for you guys today. Seeing the reaction that everyone had to the video I made about the 10 most gangster cities in Massachusetts, I'm guessing people will be equally or more interested in one about the entire New England region. These are the types of videos where I get the most viewer interaction and where you guys at home seem to get the most excited about, for better or worse. I assumed the video I made about Massachusetts was going to get a lot of comments, but almost 3,000, that was mind-blowing. I'm proud of myself. I initially responded to every comment, but after more than 1,000 responses, it was too much for me to keep up with. But I'm so grateful for the activity on the channel, positive or negative. Thank you guys for watching and commenting. We're growing so fast. So after reading many of the comments, people were asking about cities in different states in New England other than Massachusetts, basically asking if I ever cover other places and leaving information about certain cities and events. I have to say, obviously I'm partial, but this channel has the best comment section on YouTube. If you take the time to read through the discourse, you can find out so much information and leads to many stories. So I got the bright idea from reading the comments and gauging the overall reaction that, hey, maybe I should do a video about the 10 most gangster cities in New England. It's like, why just make Massachusetts people angry when I can annoy an entire region? I'm just kidding. That's never my intention to purposely irritate people. I'd much prefer if you actually liked the video, but I guess as long as you're watching, that's all I can really ask for. So just right off the top, I'm letting you guys know I'm including at least one city from all the 6 states in New England. No one is being excluded from my list. I won't accept it. Obviously, overall, New England is the safest region in America, but that doesn't mean that there aren't some of the deepest entrenched and oldest street organizations on the East Coast in some New England cities. It's true that the majority of these groups are based out of and originated in Massachusetts or Connecticut, but there isn't one state in the New England region that hasn't been affected by the street culture. In the northern 3 states, it's been an increasing problem in recent years. Driven by the promise of large profits, many organizations have moved north and set up operations in cities and sometimes small rural towns. So without further ado, get ready to be entertained, or for some odd reason, very upset by the 10 most gangster cities in New England. So here we go, number 10, and arguably the safest state in the entire country, Burlington, Vermont. So I went back and forth about which city to pick to represent the state of VT, because yes folks, sadly this is Vermont's only entrance on the list today. Historically, the worst city in Vermont has mostly been Rutland, which is a small city of 15,000 plus people on the western edge of the state off of routes 4 and 7. It's been one of Vermont's most unsavory cities for decades, with a depressed economy, crime, bad schools, and addiction, you know, the usual gamut. Compared to a lot of Vermont, it's kind of run down, there's trailer parks, it's a typical kind of poor white rural community. It's in close proximity to the busy Killington ski resort, but that hasn't seemed to trickle down economically for Rutland. In the 1990s and early 2000s, members of Los Solitos, a Latino street organization from Hartford, Connecticut, came up to Rutland and set up shop and began to infiltrate the local narcotics scene. This set the stage for what has now become Vermont's biggest challenge from a criminal justice standpoint. Various criminal organizations from Massachusetts, Connecticut, and beyond are targeting Vermont as a place to come and make a lot of money. There are many addicts in Vermont, but a very limited supply of product. Plus, the goods can be sold in Vermont at an incredible price. Because of the lack of supply, dealers are able to mark up their product for unimaginable prices compared to what they're receiving back in their home cities. This was too great of an opportunity for many aspiring trappers, and they took the trip north. What happened in Rutland in the 90s and early 2000s now has spread all over the state to cities, towns, and even very rural areas. Plus, in recent years, the Vermont-Canada border has become extremely active. Burlington is Vermont's largest city at 44,528 residents, and if you add in South Burlington, then the metro area of Vermont's largest city doesn't even break 70,000 residents, which would be considered a medium-sized city in Massachusetts. Vermont's capital city of Montpelier has less than 8,000 residents. That's like the size of Rockport, Massachusetts. Literally, the whole town shuts down at 9 p.m. You can't get anything to eat or go to a store anywhere after 9. Vermont, which in general is one of the lower 48 states, least populated, has only 647,464 residents. That's less than a 100,000 person difference from Boston's population for the whole state of Vermont. Burlington, being the state's largest city, has seen a dramatic increase in crime, violence, and street activity in the past decade. It's kind of a perfect storm, with dealers already coming into Vermont from out of state to sell their product. Then in 2020, amid protests in the political and social climate, Burlington decided to actually proceed with many people's calls to defund the police. Taking criticism from the public for doing an already difficult job, many police left the force by choice. Some had their positions taken, and others who remain on the force can only stand by and watch with their hands tied as the city descends into chaos. Seeing little to no threat by the police, crews began to set up right in downtown Burlington in public areas, parks, outside of churches, even City Hall. Openly dealing and then people using followed. Not only has this attracted dealers, but many users from all over Vermont are coming to Burlington to partake. There's a rumor that guys from even as far away as Pennsylvania are coming to Burlington to sell. I've heard that Trank has even found its way up here, and that brings its own element of chaos and horror. While Trank is widespread on Mass Ave now, Philadelphia is the most well-known sore spot for Trank making its way up the East Coast. It's kind of sad. I used to go up to Burlington all the time as a kid with my parents. It was a cool, funky little city back then. It was very artsy with hippies all over the place. Plus, you had the really nice College of University of Vermont up there. The city is right on the beautiful Lake Champlain, which is the natural border for Vermont and much of upstate New York. My father and I used to visit Fort Ticonderoga, which is nearby and was a really important fort during the French and Indian and Revolutionary Wars. It was an important outpost during the old days of the frontier and pioneers. My favorite time period in American history. Hopefully one day you guys will watch me make videos about that stuff. While comparatively to other US cities, Burlington isn't really that bad, the quality of life is going down for the citizens of the city. People all over the downtown area camped out, using in broad daylight with no recourse. Homelessness has grown exponentially. Many times they're camping out right downtown in open spots, often on church properties, and a large parking garage in the center of the city has become a sanctuary for this activity. Besides the narcotics activity, violence is on a steady rise as well. Last year, there were 5 bodies in Burlington, which is a high number for a small city. Also in 2022, there were almost 30 incidents where weapons were discharged. This is up significantly from 13 in 2021 and even more dramatically from just 1 in 2017. So in a 5-year span, Burlington went from having 1 incident with a weapon to almost 30. That's pretty significant. There's also guys up here in blue and red. There's GDs, Latin Kings, plus random hybrid crews up in Burlington selling and beefing with each other. Down in the southeastern part of the state on the Connecticut River, the small old mill town of Brattleboro also sits right on Route 91, the new narco interstate directly north of Springfield, Holyoke, and Hartford, Connecticut. Many Latin Kings and other crews have come north and began flooding Brattleboro and the surrounding areas with product. Now, quickly before I move on to the next city on the list, I just want to add that Bennington, Vermont has also seen a steady increase in out-of-state narco traffickers and violent offenders setting up in their community. The small town sits on the other side of the narrow bottom of the state of Vermont from Brattleboro, close to the Massachusetts border. It's directly north of Pittsfield, a seedy city out in the far west of Massachusetts, but like Brattleboro, it's mostly organization members from Springfield, Holyoke, and the Chicopee area that are coming to Bennington. Apparently a hybrid group called 03 Block were beefing with the Latin Kings over a specific trap house. This is what the different groups do. They find vulnerable addicts in the community and manipulate them into letting them sell out of their place. This resulted in several incidents involving weapons that eventually culminated in a young man from Massachusetts losing his life and being dumped on the side of a snowy mountain road. Also, just to note, Haverhill, Massachusetts rising rapper Fetty G's was unalived by locals in a Vermont-Canada border town several years ago. Many think it was over a narcotics dispute. Even though it seems like a very safe, wholesome place, Vermont has a seedy underbelly that is deeply entrenched and unfortunately isn't going away anytime soon. Alright, so moving on to the number 9. A city that's in the second safest state in the country. Well, Vermont and Maine go back and forth, but I'm going to say Vermont's the safest and Maine's number 2. Lewiston, Maine. Lewiston is the second largest city in the state after Portland with 37,227 residents, but its sister city, Auburn, right across the Androscoggin River, has 24,263 residents, so its metro area is a little over 60,000 people. When people say Lewiston, they usually say Lewiston, Auburn, like it's the same place. Technically, it's two different cities, but it's more like one big city. And honestly, even though it's only 60,000 people, which is like a medium-sized city in Massachusetts, when you're driving around downtown by the old giant mill buildings after being in the country that surrounds Lewiston, Auburn, it almost feels like you're in a decent-sized city. Like I've said a million times before on this channel, I'm a sucker for old mill cities. I love the architecture. There's something grand about those giant old brick buildings. They just don't build structures like that anymore. They just don't build them like that anymore in America. I went with my ex around 10 years ago to Lewiston, Auburn. We almost moved up to a small town just outside to live and work on a horse farm. Luckily, that did not happen. But I thought Lewiston and Auburn was a cool place. It was like a city on the comeback. There were new cool restaurants coming up downtown. There was also a blossoming local art scene. You have Bates College nearby. Like many other old industrial cities, they began putting up those giant beautiful murals on the walls of the old mill buildings downtown. But you could definitely tell Lewiston had a rough edge to it as well. Like a lot of these old mill cities in Maine, like my personal favorite Biddeford, and other cities like Sanford, the industry has long since passed, leaving in its wake the usual unemployment, addiction, poor education systems, and high crime rates. I remember the first time I went through Biddeford when I was like 12 with my mom in the mid-90s. We used to go on road trips up the Maine coast and sometimes go all the way up to Rangeley, which is like deep in moose country. But we stopped at a convenience store in downtown Biddeford, and there was this pregnant girl with her belly hanging out, slugging a natty daddy, arguing with her boyfriend who had like 2 teeth in his whole head. And I was like, where in the world am I right now? Even though Maine overall is a very safe state and has a low crime rate comparatively to the United States, many of its communities and residents have what you would call a rough edge to them. Some towns are visibly rough like Biddeford, which amusingly enough sits right across the river from Saco, Maine, which is much nicer. My grandpa always used to tell me all the paper factory workers lived in Biddeford and the bosses lived in Saco. Even compared to the larger city of Portland though, Lewiston has a more active street culture, especially later than the other cities in Maine. So, of course, the community of Lewiston has been reeling after that terrible incident that happened a couple of years ago, the mass incident at a bowling alley. It's like terrible to think, man. I take my kids to the bowling alley all the time in Gloucester to have fun, like a place where families are going to have fun and enjoy themselves. Something like that happens. When I initially looked at the stats, it was like 19 bodies in Lewiston. I was like, oh my God, I got to move this way up on the list. But then I realized it was all from basically that terrible incident that happened. So just prayers and well wishes to the city of Lewiston. What a terrible thing. Like that kind of stuff doesn't usually happen in the New England region. Like Vermont, Maine also has many addicts, and organizations from out of state have come to Maine cities like Lewiston to capitalize on this. Because the majority of Maine is very rural and many people depend on hunting for survival, almost everyone has weapons and it's very easy to obtain them. Neighboring Massachusetts has some of the strictest weapon laws in the United States, pushing members of street organizations to try to find weapons in other states that have less strict laws. This has become a huge operation between the two states. Members of street organizations have been flooding Maine with illicit goods in returns for arsenal of weapons to use in defense of their operation and to attack rivals. This was a huge part of the TRG end of the massive Operation Street Sweeper case a few years back. The feds allege that members of TRG from Lynn and other cities on Boston's North Shore were bringing mass quantities of Fetty and other products into Maine in return for various deadly weapons that they brought back into Massachusetts. The giant federal RICO case against Heath Street in Boston this past winter also alleged that members of the Fiat organization out of Boston's biggest public housing project were also trafficking narcotics into Maine in return for lots of weapons. Strange how in states like Maine and Vermont, where literally almost every resident owns a weapon if not multiple weapons, crimes involving those weapons are among the lowest in the country. Very odd. Maybe it's the people operating them and not the inanimate objects. What do I know? Either way, Lewiston in particular has unfortunately seen a rise in these crimes and the street culture that goes along with it, especially over this past summer. It centers in another interesting aspect of Lewiston's mystique, their Somalian community. Yes, it's a very surprising fact for some people that there's a very sizable Somalian community in the Lewiston, Auburn metro area. At its height at around 2011, the Somalian community numbered close to 10,000 people, over a quarter of the entire city's population. That would put Maine as having the fourth largest Somalian population in the entire United States. This is very interesting for people because Maine is an incredibly white state with very little ethnic diversity. But in the same case as old mill towns like Lowell, Mass., after the industry died out, it left many vacant buildings and accessible cheap housing. So like many Cambodian refugees in the late 70s and early 80s that began moving into Lowell, Somalian refugees began moving into Lewiston in the late 90s and early 2000s. I remember me and my friends used to go to this sketchy rave in Lewiston a lot in the early 2000s, and there was a gas station right nearby off the highway, and all hours of the night there'd be tons of Somalians all out and about around that area. That's when I first noticed the large group in the city, and it intrigued me how they ended up there. When I came back 15 years later with my ex, I saw that the Somalian community had firmly planted their roots in the city. Their numbers have decreased slightly. It now stands somewhere between 3,000 and 6,000, but it's still a sizable portion of the population. One neighborhood in the Somalian community has become synonymous with the street crime that now plagues Lewiston, and that's Knox Street, which has become, especially since this past summer, the city's main crime hotspot. Many of the younger people refer to it as K Block, and there's a crew called 77 K Block. In July, a 17-year-old was found dead nearby on Rideout Avenue, a victim of street violence. Since then, especially in August, there were multiple incidents involving weapons on K Block, making residents feel unsafe walking in the neighborhood after dark. Lewiston is kind of a city on the brink, though. It has the infrastructure and capabilities to be a nice city of good size and draw young, artsy, hip people. It's in close proximity to Interstate 95, and even though it's surrounded by very rural communities, it's not a far drive from the White Mountains in North Conway in New Hampshire, which draws hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of visitors every year. Lewiston is kind of the closest big city and could become a destination spot. But the city has its work cut out for it. Among the rising street violence, narcotics use and homelessness are also up in the city, and it's becoming more noticeable like in many other cities lately. Portland, Maine's largest city, which is also affluent and has a vibrant food and hipster scene, also has a crazy amount of homeless people, and the problems continue to grow, especially in the last few years. Soaring housing costs mixed with more and more people getting lost out on the street is what's causing the growing problem in the beautiful old maritime city. In regards to the growing problem of street violence in the city of Lewiston, especially among the Somalian community, it's the same old tale of the disconnect between immigrants and the first generation of children growing up in American cities. The immigrant parents often work a lot, sometimes multiple jobs. They're not familiar with American or urban culture and don't know what the signs to look for with their children to know if they're getting involved in the street life or not. It's very similar to what happened to first generation Cape Verdean, Haitian, or Cambodian and Lao children in Massachusetts during the 80s and 90s. Their parents had no idea what the warning signs were before it was too late. A lot of the Somalians have pushed back against the authorities, but if Lewiston is going to see some positive results, the two sides will need to work together. Before we move on to number 8, there's another interesting ethnic criminal element in Maine besides the gangs of Little Mogadishu and Lewiston that I'd like to quickly address. For a state that's very overwhelmingly white, and besides Portland and Lewiston really doesn't have much diversity, interestingly enough, I've learned that Chinese organized crime elements have moved into Maine. Their specialty has been setting up large-scale grow houses in small rural communities. The FBI and the Maine DEA say that there have been over 270 large-scale grow houses shut down throughout the state, and authorities believe the industry in Maine alone is worth a whopping $4.37 billion. That's billion with a B. The businesses are spread throughout 12 different counties in the state, so it's very widespread. Much of the bud that's grown is shipped out to other markets where it can be sold at a higher value. Maine has very loose laws on the subject, and most Mainers grow their own and have for decades, so it's not so much to be sold in the actual state of Maine, it's just the ideal place to set up such an operation. Most of the houses were rented or bought for very cheap money and are in very rural areas where there are little to no neighbors. Many of the houses have become uninhabitable after because the grow operations have been infested with black mold, a common problem in indoor grows if they're not properly taken care of. In another instance, a house burnt down from lights and air filters not being plugged into the proper ballast. Maine is the state with the largest border with Canada and New England, but there doesn't seem to be as much activity as the Vermont-Canada border, but I'm sure plenty of things cross over the vast wilderness in northern Maine. Most of the people busted for the grows are not illegal immigrants sneaking across the border from China, so I'm not sure where the Chinese organized crime connection is, but you know the FBI never lies. So coming in at number 8 is Manchester, New Hampshire, otherwise known on the streets as Manch Vegas. I remember first hearing about Manch Vegas from my older brother who went to UNH in the early 1990s. Some teenage hoodlums almost beat him up at a local hockey rink when he was skating with some friends from school. Unlike the other two states I just discussed, New Hampshire, especially southern New Hampshire, has been dealing with these problems since the late 80s, especially the 1990s. The northern part of the Merrimack Valley is across the New Hampshire border, and just like the valley is in Massachusetts, it also has a lot of the same problems in New Hampshire. Manchester sits directly north of huge source cities like Lowell, Mass. Via Route 3, and especially Lawrence, Mass. Via Interstate 93. Lawrence, Mass. Has become in the past 20 years one of the main source cities for narcotics for the entire northern New England area, but most certainly southern New Hampshire, which has been hit especially hard lately. When President Trump was originally campaigning in 2016, he went to southern New Hampshire, which in the late 2010s skyrocketed from one of the lowest death rates in the country to the highest. Trump called out Lawrence specifically for flooding southern New Hampshire with cheap and deadly fetty. But Manchester has become a bit of a source city itself in recent decades. Many criminal elements from Massachusetts and beyond have come to Manchester and set up shop, pumping product into the neighboring towns and counties. Since the early 2000s, most of the area right across the Mass border has all the same problems. Salem, New Hampshire is right across from the rough Massachusetts city of Haverhill, and Nashua is the first stop up Route 3 before you hit Manch Vegas. These communities have basically become kind of an overflow for the Massachusetts communities of Merrimack Valley, which have all the same problems. Manchester is just kind of a dismal place. There's not a lot going on. It's pretty economically depressed. The city just kind of has a down on its luck feel. The last couple decades and the massive narcotics problem the city has faced really hasn't helped all that much. New Hampshire has more going on than its neighboring states of Maine and Vermont, but when you get north of Manchester and the capital city of Concord, right north of Manch Vegas on 93, it gets very rustic. You have the beautiful White Mountains, which is kind of a home away from home for me. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people go up there every year. There's things to do year-round outside, but it's most well known for its ski resorts. North Conway is the main commercial area in that region. Besides North Conway, there's Berlin and Gorham up in the northern part of the state. Besides that, it's mostly just mountains and wilderness. New Hampshire has a very small border with Canada. The top of the state geographically forms what looks like almost a mountain peak. Besides the Merrimack Valley section of southern New Hampshire, the small coastal area is the other most populated area of the state. The city of Portsmouth is beautiful. I used to go up there all the time. My ex's brother had a condo right downtown on State Street, and he kept his boat tied up on a landing on the river right downtown. The small town of Rhode is also very nice as well. And of course, then you have Hampton Beach, which draws millions of people every year. The seacoast has a bit of a rougher edge back in the day, and I guess Portsmouth was a bit run down before its renewal. The town of Dover up the river, I guess, used to have a bit of a reputation too, but it's been changing for the better lately. But its neighboring town of Rochester still hasn't shaken its bad reputation, unfortunately. And then there's Seabrook. But we don't have to start bashing Seabrook, okay? We don't have to do that. We got more class than that. It wouldn't be nice. It's not their fault that they have a nuclear plant that's mutating everybody. It's just, it's terrible. I wouldn't say for a large city, or certainly the state's largest city, it's very dangerous, not overall by American standards. In 2023, there were 8 bodies in Manch Vegas, which is the same as smaller large cities in Massachusetts like Lynn or Brockton. Manchester is nowhere near as dangerous as Springfield, Massachusetts, or Hartford, Connecticut, or even Boston, but still for New Hampshire, it's bad. There really isn't anything else to compare it to in the Grand State. New Hampshire is very white and very conservative, and that's another thing. I always remember hearing dudes from Lawrence, Haverhill, and Methuen, even guys from Nashua, Salem, and Manchester, who'd go up to southern New Hampshire to trap, even though it's just minutes across the border in Salem or Plastow. If you get popped with even just one little crumb of something, you're doing years upstate. I'm not sure if the penalties have changed in recent years, but New Hampshire has some crazy draconian laws. Things that will get you 18 months in Middleton will get you a dime upstate in Berlin. It was just the difference of being in Lawrence, Mass. Or Salem, New Hampshire. The profits were just so much more in New Hampshire that the temptation was just too much. Like the other northern New England states, New Hampshire had very lax weapon laws, and they're abundant and easy to procure. Most of the organizations operate in Lawrence, Haverhill, Lowell, and Methuen get their weapons from people in New Hampshire. A lot of the times they're traded for narcotics. The Latin Kings and the GDs have operated in Manch Vegas for years, since at least the 1990s. The Trinitarios, who are numerous in Lawrence, Haverhill, and Methuen, also have a strong presence in southern New Hampshire. About 10 years ago, a set of red guys called Nine Trey were active in the city, and a couple assaults with high-powered weaponry happened because of them. Now, some of the boldest claims I've heard is that Mexican cartels are openly operating in Manch Vegas, and often people go missing in the city unreported. Alrighty, moving south now, because unfortunately that's all we have in store for our fair northern New England states. If you were wondering why I was droning on and on about these states, that's why, because for the remainder of this list, we'll be focusing on the 3 states on the southern portion of the New England region. So coming in at number 7, we have Brockton, Massachusetts. Now, okay, some people might be like, hey man, didn't you have Brockton at number 1 on your Massachusetts list? Does this mean this is the only Massachusetts city on the list? No. So why am I choosing to put Brockton so far back on this list? Well, first off, because it's my list and I have those type of executive powers, but also I figured let's give some of the other cities a little shine, shall we? I pretty much said when I made that video, I wasn't saying that Brockton was the most dangerous city in Massachusetts. No. Springfield, most definitely, and Boston are definitely more dangerous than Brockton. Even Lynn on my North Shore has made bodies in 2023, but Brockton is definitely a very gangster city, and it's also one of the most diverse underworlds as well. Brockton has been a rough city since early in the 20th century, but street culture has been locked in since the 1980s. Brockton now has a bigger black percentage of the population than the city of Boston. It's the 10th biggest Haitian population in the United States and the largest population of Cape Verdeans in the entire country. Cape Verdeans make up 20% of Brockton's total population. Other large ethnic groups in the city are Jamaicans and Brazilians. Boxing great, marvelous Marvin Hagler and Rocky Marciano both hailed from Brockton. The notorious 1%er motorcycle club, the Outlaws, who based their operations out of Brockton, and the nearby tough city of Taunton is also a stronghold. Also made man in the patriarchal crime family, Carmen Totoro, was from Brockton. So real quick, I just want to give out another guy who's keeping the Brockton boxing tradition going. King Kevin Walsh. He just had a great victory against a Worcester boxer. He's kept his undefeated streak going. I think he's at like 15-0 now. This kid is an incredible boxer. He's shredded. You don't have like an ounce of fat on him. So I want to give a shout out to King Kevin Walsh. I started following him on Instagram. He's keeping on the boxing tradition in Brockton. And I know I just said, when I say Brockton or something like that, guys, I'm saying a lot of words in this video, and I have kind of like a little speech impediment, so I try my best. Make fun of me if you will, okay? But if you have a problem with it, I'll send Kevin Walsh after you. Alright, since we've already covered Brockton before in the last video about the most gangster cities in Massachusetts, and we really need to speed things up here a little bit. We're only at number 6, and if I ever want to get this video out to you guys, let's move on, shall we? At number 6, in the fair state of Connecticut, we have Bridgeport. Bridgeport is actually Connecticut's largest city population-wise. It's in the closest proximity to New York City, only about 40 miles from the dangerous Bronx borough. Connecticut historically probably gets it even worse than Massachusetts does, with the misconception that it's all wealthy white people, there aren't any hoods, that it's just country clubs, people playing tennis with their sweaters tied around their necks. Not true. Connecticut has some very active cities and hoods, and actually is the most dangerous state in New England. Just because a lot of wealthy white people moved from New York City into Connecticut and settled, so did the street culture of the Big Apple. That's the one thing about Connecticut that separates it from the rest of New England. It's technically part of the tri-state area, and they very much identify with New York City, not Boston. Most people in Connecticut wear Yankees hats, which, by the way, really sorry about the World Series, guys. Better luck next year. I was in a program in Florida with a kid from Bridgeport. Every day he wore his Yankee fitted on top of his male pattern baldness blighted head. He always had some kind of sideways comment about whatever Boston gear I had on that day. That was really the first experience I had outside of Massachusetts, and when I really realized that not everyone thinks we're as awesome as we think we are. Jealousy was my conclusion. Either way, though, Bridgeport since the late 80s and early 90s has had some very active and entrenched street organizations. It was during this time that a product came on the scene and turned every ghetto in America upside down. And congratulations to the Dodgers for their courageous victory in the World Series, and so sorry to the New York Yankees fans. Just Alrighty, well, it seems that the city is mostly split between two factions as far as the streets go. On one side, you have one, aka the original North End, which is based out of the Trumbull Gardens housing projects on Trumbull Avenue, formerly known as the Beardsley Terrace housing development at Bridgeport's North End. They're allied with the Green Home Boys, or GHB, otherwise known as Huts, based in the Charles F. Green Homes housing complex in Bridgeport's North End. These two hoods have been locked in a bitter conflict with the East End gang, a vicious crew out of East Bridgeport, which is also aligned with the P.T. Barnum gang from the P.T. Barnum projects in Bridgeport's South End, the East Side gang, which is different than the East End gang, and 150, which is a crew based out of the west side of the city. These two supergroups have been locked in a bitter feud over the last decade or so, but it heated up dramatically in 2020 when GHB/Huts and one members slid on East End gang members in a brazen daytime attack right in front of the state courthouse on Golden Hill Street in Bridgeport. Over 20 rounds were spent in the attack. After this insane display of wanton violence, Bridgeport authorities, with the help of the FBI, began a massive investigation into the two groups and their feud. The massive federal investigation culminated in the conviction of 47 members of these assorted organizations. The investigation solved 8 deaths and approximately 20 attempts attributed to the feud. The case wrapped up in December of 2023, so we'll see how it affects Bridgeport going forward, see if things cool down between these two factions. I've also heard that there's presence of both blue and red in the city. The red can be found in the Maplewood Avenue area. I don't know what it is about Maplewood Ave, but I feel like it's a bad neighborhood in any city. Bridgeport is referred to by the natives as Park City, and in my opinion, it's definitely one of the most gangster cities in New England for sure, for decades upon decades. Bridgeport ended 2023 with 15 bodies. Not a crazy number for a city of its size, but certainly a big enough number to understand that it's something that definitely takes place in the city and on somewhat of a regular basis. The Italian LCN has had a presence in Bridgeport, just like they did basically all over the state of Connecticut. And just like their sports alliances, Connecticut was strictly territory of the New York Five families and not the Patriarchas. Well, not all of Connecticut, but we'll talk about that a little later. A Gambino member, Frank Piccolo, was whacked by Genovese members back in the day over a beef. The two families have battled over the city's rackets for years. The city has also had some political corruption that may or may not have been tied in with organized crime, with both their mayor and the chief of police being under federal investigation at the same time. Alright, so talking about the mob and political corruption gives us a perfect segue into number 5 on our list, the city of Providence, Rhode Island. Alrighty, so Providence, Rhode Island, the largest city in America's geographically smallest state. Providence, at just under 200,000 residents, is the third largest city in New England and is one of my personal favorite cities. I've loved Providence ever since my buddy Colin went to Johnson & Wales back in the early 2000s. Providence is a pretty loose city. It's almost like going back in the time. I had dreams of going to culinary school at Johnson & Wales before I got kicked out of high school and got my GED at a program. It would have been really fun, but I guess I really didn't need to be $100,000 in school loan debt just so I could party with a bunch of cute, thick girls who had dreams of becoming pastry chefs. I remember one of the first times we went down there to party, I sent Colin's sister in the store to get me a 6-pack, and she came out with a 12-pack cut in half that was duct taped all around the case. I guess that's how they roll in Providence. Rhode Island really isn't exactly what I'd call backwards. It just hasn't really lost all its fun yet like Massachusetts. It's what I'd call a very interesting place. So Providence, since the 1950s, was the seat of the New England crime family, or the Borgata. Raymond Patriarcha ruled everything east of the Connecticut River from the 1950s all the way until the early 1980s, with an almost unheard of run as the dawn of New England. Raymond ran his vast bookmaking and extortion empire out of his coinomatic shop on Atwell's Avenue in Providence's Federal Hill neighborhood. This still to this very day is Providence's Little Italy, and honestly, it's just as good if not better than Boston's North End. I'm sorry guys, I'm obviously a Boston kid all the way through, but Federal Hill is just such a cool place. Providence is Italian like Boston has traditionally been Irish. When you walk through the archway at Atwell's Avenue with the pine cones on it, you know you're there. There's endless Italian restaurants with great authentic cuisine. Providence in general has a great and diverse food scene. I'm sure the local culinary school plays a part, but it's a great city for food, especially for its size. Raymond ran the family from Providence, controlling the largest city of Boston with his underboss Jerry Angiulo in the North End. Raymond controlled all of Rhode Island, some of Connecticut, all of Mass except for Springfield. That belonged to the Genovese family in New York City, and he also had action in Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. After he passed away, he left his son Ray Jr. in charge, but unfortunately he was not his father and he lost control of the family. A huge war erupted in the 1990s and the family was never really the same again. The boss shifted back to Boston for a while, but Providence still is 100% a mob town. They operate much different now and are much more under the radar than ever, but they're most certainly still very active in the Providence underworld. Beyond the Italian LCN, there are plenty of active street organizations in Providence, including Black, Latino, and Cape Verdeans as well. Providence can be deceptive. You can walk around in a neighborhood and it seems quiet and nice, but in a blink of an eye, something can and usually will go down. Also, you can find yourself going from a decent neighborhood into a sketchy one very quickly. The thing I like most about Providence is it hasn't been gentrified yet as much as Boston or most of Massachusetts. It still feels like the early 2000s in Providence. I mean, they fixed up the downtown area and it looks nice, but they haven't gutted the soul of the city yet like they're currently doing in Boston. There's sketchy Dominican clubs that stay open and serve drinks most likely 24 hours a day, and that's another thing. I remember when my buddy was a freshman, you could go to clubs in Providence at 18, not 21, and when you're inside, no one carded you for a drink. So Providence has a mix of local, homegrown, and nationally syndicated street crews. There's a huge red hood in North Providence, which is probably the biggest hood as far as actual streets go. They refer to themselves as Northside BHB or the 4. There's another red set down in Upper South Providence right next to the old Johnson and Rails campus called the Lockwood Bees. Right next to them, like directly on JWU's campus, is a crew called Pine 6 Zone 5 187. Right near the Lockwood Bees is some sets from the blue side. You have the Hanover Boys C's or HBZ, and they share the same area with a set of Grape Street C's as well. There's also a couple sets of Grape Street and Rolling 60s in the gritty nearby city of Central Falls, Rhode Island. All the way down by the Roger Williams Parks and Zoo, there's a couple sets called GMF 307 and G-Way. Also, other notable hoods are HP, the M, and HOD, but one of the worst rivalries in the past few years has been between the Chad Brown gang out of the Chad Brown Projects and the East Side crew. The feds were able to use RICO against 4 members of the Chad Brown after a brazen attack against their rivals in which innocents were caught in the crossfire. Providence has become a very Latino city in the past few decades. There was some big festival recently. I think it was like a Dominican festival. I've seen so many videos on Instagram where there were just widespread brawls throughout the city with captions like, are there even cops in Providence anymore? Which this reminds me when I'm mentioning Instagram. If you're on Instagram, you don't already follow me, go ahead. It's J_Trimmins. I tease like upcoming videos on my stories. I just am trying to get to 1,000 followers. I have like 22,000 subscribers on YouTube and I don't even have 1,000 followers on Instagram. I just started becoming active a couple months ago, but if you can, go ahead and follow me, okay? It's just like kind of an ego thing, I guess, at this point, but whatever, man. I'm not perfect. Like I said earlier, there's also Cape Verdeans running through Rhode Island as well. Most people think of Upham's Corner in Dorchester or Brockton, but Providence, Central Falls, and the Bucket, as it's called by locals, also has its share. The Bucket West, which is home to rapper Little Alonzo, who I'm a fan of, and his ops across town, Little to 3. Providence, Pawtucket, and Central Falls all kind of mesh into one another. A lot of the politics are all intertwined. It's a very small state, and the streets can get really messy. I heard that back in the 1990s, some Puerto Rican traffickers were pumping more Perico out of the small city of Central Falls, Rhode Island, than anywhere else in New England. Obviously, there's no way to prove this, but it's just a legend I've heard. Providence definitely gets stuff coming up I-95 from New York City. Providence is kind of a buffer zone between Boston culture and New York City. The deals in Providence were definitely taken after New York dealers and not Boston or Eastern Mass guys selling stamped wax baggies and bundles of bricks instead of G's, half fingers, or full fingers. Just an observation by a former head here. So moving on from the beautiful little corrupt ocean state, now we're getting into the big boys, the top 4 most gangster cities in New England. Seeing the ground we've already covered, it might be pretty obvious what the top 4 to you are. Maybe some of you just can't figure out what the placement of them are, or maybe you don't live inside my head and you have no idea what the top 4 are. Anyhow, let's dive in, shall we? Numero 4, New Haven, Connecticut, or as my boy Mike Gill calls it, Wavin', New Haven. You picking up what I'm throwing down? New Haven is actually Connecticut's 3rd largest city after Bridgeport, and then the industrial city of Stamford is the 2nd largest city right near the New York border. The big old industrial and port cities along the coastline of the Long Island Sound are the backbone of Connecticut's tough urban core. The rest of the state in the northeast are mostly wealthy suburbs, and in the northwest it's very rural with a lot of farms. It's actually some very beautiful landscapes. My cousin got married in like north central Connecticut, and it was all tobacco farms. I didn't even know that kind of stuff existed out there. New Haven is a notoriously dangerous city. It had 23 bodies in 2023, down from 27 in 2022, which is pretty high numbers compared to other New England cities close to that size, like Manchester, New Hampshire, which only had 8 in 2023. New Haven technically had the highest crime rate in the entire state of Connecticut and is 65% higher than the U.S. average. New Haven's pride and joy is Yale University, the Ivy League rival to Cambridge's Harvard, and is also the economic hub of the depressed city. Just like Bridgeport is nicknamed Park City, New Haven goes by the nickname Elm City. Someone left that in a comment way back when I made a video about Wild Guy Grasso. New Haven, or Elm City's gangster tradition, goes back much farther than the street crews that exist today. Like Bridgeport was in the Spear of the Five Families, New York, New Haven too, it had influence from the New York mob. The Colombo family, especially with its vicious henchmen like Capo, Ralph White, Trupiano, had its hands in the New Haven rackets. Tropiano had a vicious young hoodlum from New Haven under his wing called Bill Wild Guy Grasso. Once Wild Guy was sentenced to 12 years in prison for trying to take over the entire New Haven garbage rackets by force, he met the man Raymond L.S. Patriarca while incarcerated, and it changed his life. After wrapping up his sentence, Grasso switched up alliances and joined the Patriarchas. Raymond, who had taken power in the 1950s, was by the 1970s trying to expand his domain. After quelling rebellions in his own city with the Maffeo brothers and managing to get all the crazy Irish gangs in Boston to settle down in the 1960s, Raymond fixed his attention on the lucrative Connecticut rackets. The Colombos, Gambinos, and Genovese all had their hands in the New Haven underworld. In the 1970s, Wild Guy got to work, a Gambino representative disappeared off the New Haven streets, and then one of their capos was taken out with a car bomb. In 1978, a Genovese representative was released from prison, and then a year later disappeared off the Elm City streets. Then a year after that, in 1980, Grasso's former mentor, Ralph Whitey Tropiano, was whacked, and this allowed Raymond to declare everything east of the Housatonic River now belonged to his Borgata. Wild Guy began to build his own fiefdom in New Haven, taking over a restaurant called Franco's on Franklin Street in New Haven's Little Italy, right off its main thoroughfare, Wooster Street, which if I'm bringing up Little Italy, I gotta shout out famous New Haven-style pizza. That's right, not pizza, a pizza. The thin crust, coal-fired Neapolitan pizza, according to Google AI, is so unique because it's made with a very wet dough that undergoes a long fermentation process, so it has a bite like a thin ciabatta. Shout out Dave Portnoy. But Grasso was a tyrant and treated his men like dirt. He demanded half of their profits, constantly bullied them, tormented them verbally and physically. After Raymond died, Junior Patriarca made Wild Guy his underboss. Grasso in turn acted like he ran the family. In combination with the Boston Renegade faction that tried but failed to whack Cadillac Frank Salemi in an IHOP parking lot in Saugus in 1989, New Haven and Hartford, Connecticut crews in conjunction with New York whacked Wild Guy and theatrically threw him in the Connecticut River, which marked the border that he kept encroaching on. Now, the modern-day crews on the New Haven streets are much different. They're much like the Bridgeport crews or any other large East Coast urban city. One of the most notorious crews to come out of the city in recent years is called Exit 8, named for the fact that they are located in a geographic area of the city that you can access off of Exit 8 on Interstate 91. That's where the name comes from. It's very imaginative. They also go by the name Honcho for their boy Honcho that got bodied in 2020. They basically beef with everyone, and authorities have cracked down on the group lately, say they are responsible for 3 bodies and at least 16 attempts. They are deeply involved in narcotics dealing and are locked in a violent feud with rivals from the city's hill section, among other areas of New Haven. Other notable hoods in Elm City are the Church Street Projects, which are located directly behind the New Haven Police Department. Their crew goes by the name the Jungle Boys. One of the Jungle Boys' biggest allies are KSI, or Kensington Street International. They're both allied with Elm Street as well. Then you have the neighborhood of New Hallville, which is referred to as the Ville. Then there's a large project way over on the eastern edge of the city overlooking the Quinnipiac River. It's cut off over by the river, and it's referred to as the Island, and the crew refers to themselves as the Island Brothers. There's also a crew on the western side of Reed Street called R2. There's also, I should mention, a major prison crew that formed with a bunch of New Haven gangs at its core called ECB, or the Elm City Boys. They rep with the colors green and black. It consists of the Hill, the Ville, Jungle Boys, KSI, and Elm City Posse. They ally with Hartford crews like the mostly black 20 Love and Latino Los Solitos, and they're against the Latin Kings, the Inietas Brotherhood inside the prison system in Connecticut. So number 3 is the deadly western Massachusetts city of Springfield. Sitting on the banks of the mighty Connecticut River, Springfield had a terrible year in 2023 with a record-breaking number of 31 bodies. Things seem to be going a little bit better for Springfield this year after it was basically becoming unhinged at the seams in 2023. Springfield is just generally kind of a lawless place, and when you're there, you can feel that energy. By the way, I hope everyone is satisfied with the visuals I'm using in this video for Springfield. The program that I do in fact pay for had a video labeled Springfield, Mass, but it was actually a train bridge in Albany, New York, and oh my word, did people have a field day with that one. By rights, I should still be hiding in the woods crying from all those hurtful comments about my inadequate geographical knowledge. I assure you that I wrote them a strongly worded letter and demanded a discount on my next year's subscription. All joking aside, Springfield, along with its neighboring city of Holyoke, are very dangerous places filled with active street organizations and a bustling narcotics trade. The Genovese family has run Springfield for the vast majority of the 20th century and still this day is active in the city, even though Anthony Arriolata did all he could to destroy the crew. The Latin Kings are a dominant force in Springfield and control the majority of the narcotics scene and a driving force behind the escalating violence in the city. In Operation Thrown Down, the feds outlined the connection between the mob and the Kings in Springfield. More than anything, historically, the gangs of Springfield have done, I'd say the biggest impact that they're having on New England is in the northwestern part of the region right now. Gangs have fled the western rural parts of Massachusetts all the way up into Vermont with cheap and deadly narcotics from which much of the violence that follows these gangs north originates from. I've talked on and on about Springfield in the past on my channel, and you haven't watched any of those videos, go check them out now, or actually after you finish watching this video. I've got at least 4 of them, so let's move on to number 2 for time's sakes. This is a real climax moment here. I'm sure most of you can guess what 1 and 2 are if I haven't mentioned them yet. And no, I'm not going to pull in North Shore City out of my rear end just to troll all you guys. The 2 final cities are from the 2 most gangster states in New England, Massachusetts and Connecticut. So honestly, I feel inside that the city I'm putting at number 2 could possibly really be the most gangster city in New England. But I would just feel too disloyal to my Mass roots if I put it at number 1. So number 2 is the very, very gangster city of Hartford, Connecticut. Yes, out of the 3 major hubs for street culture in Connecticut, Bridgeport, New Haven, and Hartford, I personally feel that Hartford stands above the rest. Listen, I know really all the real gangsters in Connecticut are from Bristol, but I gotta do this to keep the feds off their trail, you know? Anyhow, sitting directly in the middle of the state, away from the coastline and most of the bustling industrial cities of Connecticut, Hartford sits directly south of Springfield on Interstate 91, which has become the superhighway for gangs and narcotics moving up to infect the mill towns and cities and rural sleepy backroad villages off of Route 91, Interstate 91, where these gangs can hold communities of addicts hostage with their illicit products. I'm sorry to say it, guys, but Hartford and Springfield are 2 of the biggest factors contributing to many of the problems in rural, western, and northern New England. Hartford, Connecticut recorded 30 plus bodies in 2023. I'm not really sure what the plus means. Is the situation so bad in Hartford that they can't even accurately record the amount of bodies anymore? I guess it was an improvement from 2022's 39 bodies. That's an insane number for a city of less than 120,000 people. That's like the same size as Cambridge, Massachusetts, which didn't even have 1 body last year. To put it in perspective, Boston, a city over 5 times larger than Hartford's population-wise, only had 38 bodies last year. So a city that's over 5 times larger had 1 less body? That's ludicrous. In 2023, in a 10-day period, 8 people got killed. Those are literally Chicago, St. Louis, New Orleans stats, not the capital of preppy little Connecticut. So when people snicker at gangsters in Connecticut, here's some facts for you guys. People hate facts. Violent crime in Hartford is 43% higher than the U.S. average, and violent crimes were at a 20-year high from the early 2000s, which going back into the 1990s was historically the worst period in Hartford's history. Although thankfully for the city, 2024 has been a much quieter year with only 14 bodies so far compared to 30 last year. It's a historic drop, the lowest number in almost 20 years, which was a badly needed win for the city and its police department. Hartford has been known as an H city for decades, probably since the 1980s. Park Street has been one of the most iconic copping spots on the East Coast. Gangs like Hartford's Los Solitos, which put Hartford on the map, getting them their own episode on the iconic History Channel show in the early 2000s. But Los Solitos used to battle with other well-known crews like Latin Kings for control of Hartford's lucrative H trade.
So I almost lost a perfect opportunity to throw on my old school Hartford Whalers hat. I love vintage hockey stuff, but I love the Hartford Whalers. But I just also wanted to throw out there, I almost forgot to mention it as well, it'll already probably have passed by the time I hope to get this video out, if I can even upload this video because it's going to be so big. But Saturday, I'm hoping to have this video out on Monday. Saturday is my birthday. I will be turning 42 years old. I know I look very youthful and young, but if you want to get a birthday gift, you don't have to. I'm not putting any pressure. I know a lot of people are under financial stress, but if you want to get your favorite Massachusetts clam digger YouTuber birthday gift, I love hats like this and other sports apparel from the 47 website. My daughter and I, my older daughter who's 7, we go to every Gloucester High School boys and girls hockey game, and she wants desperately to go to a Bruins game this year. So if anybody has season tickets, come on, send them over this way. But most of all, guys, I accept cash. I like cash, so Cash App, Venmo. What's the other one they call it? PayPal. So just saying, guys, feel free. Don't be shy. I won't be offended by you guys, being generous with your gifts.
Los Solitos, or the Solid Ones, were a mostly Latino crew, but were open to all races. I've heard that they formed from already existing old school crews in Hartford, like the Savage Nomads and the Ghetto Boys. Like I said, the Solid Ones had beef with the Latin Kings back in the day, but other legendary crews from the gritty streets of Hartford are 20 Love, a black gang that I previously mentioned who hail from the city's north side. Also in the north end is Money Green Bedrock, Champagne Posse, and West Hell exist. Then other parts of the city, there's the Center Street Playboys, Edgewood, aka The Wood, Cabot Street, aka 40 Deuce, Vine Street, aka The Vineyard, Mather Street, aka Buck 50, a blue set called Greats, not grapes, but Greats with a T. And then there's the Orange Street Gang, who are connected with the Ave and the Hill, aka Hillside. Like I said, a lot of these Hartford crews are connected in prison with crews from New Haven, like the Elm City Boys. The Connecticut state prison system is dominated by crews from Hartford, New Haven, and Bridgeport. Some older legendary crews from the bygone days of Hartford's past are the Latin Locos and the Ghetto Boys. Hartford has long had a rough edge to it, and this isn't by any means a new trend. I remembered as a kid in the early 90s, me and my dad would drive down to South Carolina every year in April. We would drive west out in the Mass Pike, then at Springfield, take 91 down through Connecticut on the way to New York, and we'd drive through Hartford. It was one of the few cities that we actually drove right through. I remember seeing the big old pretty white Capitol building and thinking it was an impressive building, and I always remember there being this one neighborhood that looked like a straight up blighted area, burnt out buildings in the lot, and I remember as a kid just being like, wow man, that is rough. I wish I knew where that particular street was to put it into context, but Hartford is an incredibly rough city and it's number 2 on my list. Thankfully, this year has been a better year for its residents, and I hope that's a reoccurring trend. Before people get all mad at me because they think I'm saying Hartford and Springfield are cancers that are destroying the New England region, I'm simply just bringing to light a situation that's currently happening and has been occurring for years now. Until the issues in those communities are dealt with by the community leaders, they will continue to spread throughout the region. It's an unfortunate truth, and it's nothing against those 2 cities. I actually feel for the citizens, leaders should be doing a better job to make those communities safer for its residents, and most importantly, the kids. Which thankfully, both cities are seeing downward trends in 2024. So that leaves number 1 is Boston, my favorite city in the world, even with gentrification. The biggest city by far in New England is also number 1 on my list. I didn't put Boston on my list for Massachusetts cities because I didn't think it was fair to compare Boston to any of the other cities on the list, but I can't keep it off every time. I'm not going to go into reasons why Boston is number 1. My entire channel is basically videos about why Boston is number 1. It has everything from Italian LCN to Irish hoodlums, Black, Latino, Jewish, Cape Verdean, Russian, Chinese, you name it, Boston has it. And simply put, you cannot compare Dorchester, Roxbury, Mattapan, Jamaica Plain, or the South End to anywhere else in New England. There's absolutely nothing that compares to those hoods anywhere else in New England. Even with all the gentrification, it's still a city where two young men can get blasted in a busy barbershop in broad daylight, and in the aftermath can get filmed by a dude walking in off the street while a uniformed BPD officer stands there telling a victim to apply pressure to his wounds. If that's not gangster, I don't know what is. So hope you guys liked this video, man. This was a beast to get done. I stayed up till like 2:30 in the morning finishing the script and trying to get it all done. It's so much. I hope I will be able to export this file even, like, to be able to, so you guys can watch it so I can upload it onto YouTube. I don't know if I've ever done a video this big. It's going to top out probably close to an hour long. But I hope you guys enjoyed it. You guys usually really love this kind of stuff. I usually get a lot of viewer interaction. So if you did like it, you know what to do. Hit that like button. Subscribe if you're not already subscribed. Like I said, go ahead and follow me on Instagram, J_Trimmins. But most importantly, guys, this part is non-negotiable. Make good choices. Make good decisions. Take good care of yourselves, your family, your friends, your fellow human beings. Try to have a nice day, guys. I'll talk to you real soon. God bless.